In a small town, an ordinary DUI checkpoint turned into an extraordinary event. What the police initially thought was just another quiet old man turned into a federal matter that no one saw coming. This story is not just about Danny Reginald, a reclusive elderly man. It's about a promise that was kept, a mission carried out, and the weight of something bigger than anyone imagined. The soft glow of streetlights flickered against the wet pavement as the rain began to fall steadily over Ravenswood. The town, nestled between rolling hills and quiet woods, had always been a place where life moved at a leisurely pace. As the sun sank lower in the sky, the streets of Ravenswood turned into pools of reflection, the orange streetlights casting long, faint shadows across the otherwise empty roads. It was the kind of evening that wrapped the town in a sense of calm, where the usual hum of the outside world seemed far away, and only the sound of raindrops tapping against rooftops could be heard. It was on nights like these, when the world seemed to slow down and nothing out of the ordinary ever threatened to disrupt the peace, that Ravenswood truly settled into its familiar rhythm. Most of the town's residents had long since retreated into their homes, leaving the streets eerily quiet. The police officers, knowing the night would likely pass without incident, set up a routine DUI checkpoint at the edge of town, expecting little more than the occasional sleepy driver or a car with a broken taillight. In the quiet of his small home at the far edge of town, Danny Reginald sat in his favorite armchair, the dim glow of a single lamp beside him the only source of light. At 79, he had grown accustomed to solitude, and life had fallen into a simple, predictable routine. To most of Ravenswood, Danny was known simply as Old Man Danny, a nickname that spoke to his age and his quiet, somewhat mysterious nature. He lived alone in a modest house, nothing fancy, just a small dwelling tucked away near the trees where few ever ventured. The neighbors often saw him sitting on his porch, a warm cup of tea cradled in his hands as he gazed out at the road that passed by his house. He didn't talk much to anyone, preferring the peace of his own company to the chatter of the world. His old Dodge truck, a battered relic from the 60s, sat parked in the driveway. Its faded paint and worn tires told a story of years gone by, but it still ran. And that was all Danny needed. He never drove much, mostly just around town for groceries or to visit the small shop at the corner. But tonight was different. Tonight he found himself on the highway, a place he rarely ventured after dark. In the passenger seat beside him, a small metal case sat, its latch worn from years of use. The case, secured tightly with an old leather strap, was a silent companion in the car. Danny's eyes kept drifting toward it, his fingers tight around the steering wheel, his jaw clenched slightly. He had been carrying that case for longer than he cared to admit, and tonight, after all these years, he was finally going to do what he had promised. He wasn't sure if he was ready for it. He wasn't sure anyone could be ready for something like this, but he knew the time had come. The promise he made all those years ago was one he couldn't break, no matter the cost. As he approached the checkpoint, the flashing lights of the police cars reflected off the wet pavement, cutting through the rain-soaked night. There was something about the scene that made his pulse quicken. Perhaps it was the suddenness of it, or the fact that it was exactly the kind of situation he had worked so hard to avoid. The officers, mostly young faces with rain-soaked uniforms, waved drivers through or pulled them over for quick checks. Danny's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he slowed down, his eyes darting between the checkpoint and the road ahead. He could feel the weight of the small metal case beside him, its presence heavy in the air. When he reached the checkpoint, one of the officers, a young man probably in his early 30s, waved him to a stop. His uniform was drenched, and his face was tired, but his posture was alert. Danny took a deep breath, his heart thudding in his chest. He had always lived a quiet life, one that was unnoticed, and now after all these years he was about to be seen. His hands trembled slightly as he rolled down the window. The officer approached slowly, his flashlight briefly flashing over Danny's face before turning to the truck. Danny's eyes met his, but he didn't speak immediately. Instead, he simply waited as the officer leaned in, asking for his license and registration. Danny handed them over without a word, his expression unreadable. His mind wasn't on the simple traffic stop, it was on the case beside him, on the promise, and on the reason he was here tonight. The officer, glancing at the old case on the seat next to him, couldn't help but ask, "What's in the case, sir?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment Danny didn't answer. His eyes lingered on the officer's face, trying to gauge if he should speak the truth. Finally, with a quiet voice, he replied, "It's not for you. It needs to go to the bureau." The officer paused, sensing that something was off. There was a weight to Danny's words, something that didn't fit with the image of the quiet old man who had been driving through his small town for years without incident. Danny's grip on the wheel tightened, his gaze now fixed on the officer. The young man's expression faltered for a brief moment, his instincts kicking in as he realized there was more to this than just a simple traffic stop. Without another word, he signaled for Danny to step out of the truck. The rain poured relentlessly, drenching the officer as he approached Danny's truck. His uniform clung to his skin, and his boots splashed against the wet pavement. He leaned into the window, his flashlight casting fleeting shadows across Danny's face. His voice, strained from the weather, was calm as he requested Danny's license and registration. Without a word, Danny handed them over, his fingers trembling slightly, but not enough to betray his calm demeanor. The officer's eyes lingered on the small metal case resting on the passenger seat. Its old leather strap, worn and weathered, caught his attention. The case was so out of place for someone like Danny, an elderly man with a quiet life in this small town. The officer's curiosity got the better of him, and he asked, "What's in the case, sir?" Danny hesitated for a moment, his eyes never leaving the officer's face. His response was short and vague, as if carefully measured. "It's not for you. It needs to go to the bureau." The words seemed deliberate, as if he had rehearsed them in his mind before stepping out of his home tonight. Something in Danny's tone, the calmness, and the conviction with which he spoke unsettled the officer. Most drivers, especially older men like Danny, would either be nervous or make some kind of small talk, perhaps to cover up their unease. But Danny? He was unsettlingly composed. The officer's instinct, honed over years of patrols, told him that there was more to this situation than met the eye. With his curiosity piqued and a rising sense of caution, the officer asked Danny to step out of the vehicle. His voice was more insistent now, though still polite. "Please step out, sir." Without any resistance, Danny opened the door and stepped out into the rain. He stood there quietly, his posture rigid, eyes fixed not on the officers, but on the case. He didn't seem nervous or defensive, but there was an undeniable tension around him. His silence spoke volumes. He wasn't just a confused old man who had wandered into the checkpoint. He was someone with a purpose, with intent, and that intent was not clear. A second officer, younger and eager to assist, approached. He exchanged a few quick words with the first officer before turning to Danny. They both eyed the case, now an object of their shared concern. "Can we open it?" the second officer asked, his voice more direct this time. Danny shook his head, his jaw set tightly. He repeated his earlier statement, though this time it carried more weight, more finality. "It's not for you. It needs to go to the bureau." There was no hesitation, no wavering. His resolve was palpable, and it only deepened the officer's suspicion. At this point, the officers were no longer acting solely on routine. They had questions that needed answers, and Danny's behavior, though outwardly calm, was beginning to feel more like a puzzle. They needed to know what was inside that case, and why Danny was so adamant about keeping it closed. Before they could ask any more questions, a third officer, taller and more authoritative, arrived. He immediately assessed the situation and, sensing the growing unease, decided to take control. "Is he carrying anything dangerous?" he asked the other officers, his eyes scanning Danny with a new intensity. Danny's voice remained steady as he replied simply, "No." But his response wasn't enough to quell their doubts. His refusal to explain further, his calm but uncooperative attitude, everything about him felt out of place. It didn't add up. The officers exchanged glances, their uncertainty growing with each passing second. They knew something wasn't right, but they couldn't quite put their finger on it. One of them, his patience wearing thin, retrieved a pair of handcuffs. "We're going to have to place you in custody, sir," he said, his voice firm but controlled. "Please turn around." Danny's face remained unreadable, his eyes flicking briefly to the case before he turned to face the officer. There was no resistance. He stood still, his hands at his sides, and allowed the officer to slip the handcuffs on his wrists. The officers read him his rights as they guided him toward a nearby patrol car, but Danny's expression didn't change. He didn't speak. He simply let the moment pass, as though this was something he had anticipated for years. The truck was searched with methodical precision. It wasn't long before the case was removed from the front seat and placed into the back of a patrol car. Danny was then led to another vehicle, the sound of the rain now drowning out all other noises as the officers ushered him inside. As the door closed with a heavy thud, the officers took a moment to gather themselves. They radioed the station, describing the strange behavior they had encountered. "The man's a veteran," they mentioned, noting the military ID found in his wallet. "Something's off, but we don't know what." They weren't sure what to make of Danny. He didn't fit the profile of someone they needed to worry about, yet there was something undeniably unsettling about his calm demeanor. He wasn't dangerous, but his silence, his refusal to open up about the case, it left them wondering whether they had just scratched the surface of a much bigger story. As Danny sat in the back of the patrol car, the weight of the silence between him and the officers was palpable. The steady rhythm of the rain against the windows was the only sound that filled the vehicle, a constant reminder of the storm outside. His eyes were fixed ahead, but his mind was far from the empty road. It was on the case, always the case. It was a constant presence even now that it was no longer in his sight. Danny had carried it for far too many years, but tonight it had to go somewhere. It had to be delivered. The promise he'd made so long ago was now closer to its end. But was he ready? He didn't know. He could feel the uncertainty radiating from the officers in the front seat. They didn't know what they had, and the tension in the car was thick, laden with questions they couldn't answer. They would try to unravel him, to find out why he was so calm, so controlled. But Danny wasn't going to give them anything. He couldn't, and not yet. When they arrived at the station, the usual process unfolded. His hands were taken in by cold, indifferent fingerprint ink, and his photograph was snapped with the precision of someone used to doing it all in routine. There was no defiance in Danny's eyes, no resistance to the officers. It was as if he had already accepted what was happening. He wasn't scared, wasn't worried, just resigned, like a man who had spent years waiting for this very moment to come. As Danny was led away into the station's holding room, the officers began to focus on the case that had caused the entire chain of events to unfold. It was taken straight to the evidence room, where it was marked, locked away, and left for someone to figure out. But the officers' curiosity got the better of them. "What do you think it is?" one of them asked, inspecting the metal case through the glass window of the evidence room. He scratched the back of his neck, still trying to piece together the story of the quiet old man who refused to speak. "I'm guessing old war medals. Maybe something sentimental, like memorabilia he's keeping from his time in service," another officer chimed in. He wasn't convinced, but it was the most logical explanation he could come up with. He thought of Danny so quiet, so unassuming, and assumed it was just a matter of harmless personal belongings. A third officer leaned in, adding, "Could be stolen goods, you know. Maybe he's hiding something, just waiting for the right time to cash it in. Seems like the kind of guy who'd have something to hide." But none of them truly knew what it was. No one had considered that this case might hold something far more significant than old medals or stolen items. Something that could unravel decades of secrets. Meanwhile, in the cold, barren holding room, Danny sat on a metal bench, his back straight, his hands folded neatly in his lap. The room was stark, a sterile space with a camera in the corner. Nothing about it suggested comfort or care. It was a place designed for people who were waiting for something. And tonight that something was him. Danny's eyes never left the floor. He wasn't lost in thought or staring into space. His gaze was steady, focused. Even in this sterile, uncomfortable environment, he maintained the same composure that had defined him for so many years. He was a man who had lived a life of quiet endurance. Whatever was coming next, he would handle it the same way he always had, without fanfare, without noise, and without complaint. He could hear the distant sounds of the station, the murmured conversations of officers in the hallways, the occasional phone ringing. But all of it seemed far away. In this moment, it was just Danny, his past, his promise, and the case that now sat in the evidence room, locked away, waiting for the answers to be uncovered. Inside the station, the rhythmic hum of fluorescent lights overhead was interrupted only by the occasional shuffle of paperwork or a phone ringing in the distance. In the main office, the officer who had processed Danny's ID was going through the usual steps, entering the details into the system, checking for any records that might be relevant. But as he typed in the last few characters of Danny's information, something unexpected happened. A small but unmistakable alert popped up on the screen. It wasn't the kind of alert they were used to seeing. It wasn't a warrant, and it certainly wasn't a missing person match. The officer blinked, his fingers hovering above the keyboard. What was this? A higher-level notification. His brow furrowed as he leaned closer to the screen, trying to make sense of the strange message that had just flashed. He clicked back through the system, trying to retrieve the alert again, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. It was odd, unsettling. That wasn't normal. Most alerts in the system were standard and predictable routine checks, criminal records, or missing persons. But this felt different. A twinge of unease crept up his spine as he considered the implications. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stumbled onto something that wasn't meant for ordinary eyes. Moments later, as though in answer to his confusion, another message appeared, this one even more chilling than the last. Secure the individual and item. Stand by for federal response. Do not proceed with questioning. The officer read the words again, his heart rate quickening. His eyes darted across the screen. Federal response. What did that even mean? He couldn't recall a time when anything like this had happened. The instruction was clear, direct, and ominous. It was a command from somewhere far beyond the station, somewhere with more power, more influence than the local police force could ever wield. The officer quickly scanned the room, unsure of what to do next. His fingers trembled as he reached for the phone. He dialed the sergeant's extension, the urgency now evident in his voice. "Sergeant, you need to see this." The sergeant, an experienced man who had seen his fair share of strange calls, didn't hesitate. He walked over to the desk, his boots clicking against the linoleum floor. The officer quickly explained the situation, pointing to the screen. The sergeant leaned in, his expression changing from curiosity to something deeper concern, perhaps even confusion. "This isn't a glitch," the officer muttered, his eyes scanning the message one more time. "It's something else." The sergeant's eyes narrowed as he read the message. There was no mistake. The command was official, high level, and it had come from a channel they weren't authorized to access. His fingers hovered over the phone, ready to make a call that would change everything. But before he could dial, the dispatcher's voice cut through the tension in the room. "Sergeant, you might want to take this call," the dispatcher said, her voice unusually soft. "It's for you." She placed the receiver down, her fingers lingering on the switch as she gave him a look that said it all. The sergeant picked up the phone and held it to his ear, his eyes still glued to the computer screen. A pause on the other end, and then a voice he didn't recognize spoke with a calm authority that made him straighten up instinctively. "Sergeant Mitchell," the voice said, "we've been monitoring the situation with an individual by the name of Danny Reginald. We've received notification that he's in your custody. We need you to secure him and the contents of the case immediately. Federal agents are en route. Do not proceed with questioning. We'll handle the rest." The words hit like a cold wave, chilling him to the core. Danny Reginald, the quiet old man they had arrested for something as mundane as a routine traffic stop. And now federal agents were involved. The sergeant's mind raced, but there was no time for questions. He was being given orders, and in this moment it was clear that whatever was happening, it was beyond his jurisdiction. He nodded to the officer at the desk, who had been silently watching, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation. Get Danny secured, and make sure the case is locked away. No one touches it, not until they get here. As the officer moved to carry out the orders, the sergeant hung up the phone, his thoughts a blur. He had served on the force for over 25 years, dealt with every kind of case, from robberies to domestic disputes, but nothing like this. Nothing that would warrant federal involvement over a simple DUI checkpoint. He turned to the rest of the team in the room. We've got federal agents coming. I want everything handled quietly. No questions. Just cooperate and wait for them to arrive. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. They didn't know what to make of this. Who was Danny Reginald really? And why had his case warranted such high-level attention? Minutes later, the sound of the station's phone ringing again cut through the stillness. The dispatcher answered quickly, her face pale as she listened to the voice on the other end. She glanced over at the sergeant and, without a word, handed him the phone. "Sir, they're on their way. Estimated arrival less than 30 minutes. The sergeant nodded grimly, his mind still reeling from the phone call. Federal agents, no names, no explanations, just instructions to secure Danny and the case. His grip tightened around the phone, and he stared out the window of the station, watching the rain fall softly over the parking lot. The weight of what was happening started to sink in. This wasn't just an ordinary night in Ravenswood. This was something bigger, something that would change everything. As he put the phone down, the first whispers of federal authority crept into the air of the station. Danny's fate and the contents of the mysterious case were now out of their hands. As the heavy rain continued to fall outside, the atmosphere within the station became thick with anticipation. The usual calm of the small-town police station was shattered by the sound of engines approaching, low and rumbling in the quiet of the night. The officers in the station exchanged uneasy glances as they heard the unmistakable hum of several vehicles pulling into the parking lot. It wasn't the usual sirens or flashing lights, they were unmarked SUVs, their dark exteriors blending with the night. But the sheer number of them, and the quiet precision with which they parked, spoke volumes. Something had changed. Something big was happening. 6 unmarked vehicles came to a smooth stop in front of the station. The headlights briefly illuminated the wet pavement, casting long, sharp shadows that seemed to stretch forever. The SUVs were eerily quiet, no sirens, no flashing lights, just a stark contrast to the usual chaos of an emergency response. It was a subtle display of power, a silent testament to the authority that was about to take over. As the engines fell silent, the doors of the SUVs opened with synchronized precision. The men and women who stepped out moved with a practiced, deliberate rhythm. Their attire was dark and formal, their suits impeccable, every movement purposeful and controlled. There was no hesitation, no wasted time, just the quiet confidence of professionals who had seen it all before. Their expressions were unreadable, their faces hard, showing no sign of emotion or doubt. These were not the officers who had dealt with the routine cases of Ravenswood. These were federal agents, and they were here to take control. The officers inside the station watched in tense silence as the federal team gathered outside. The shift in the air was palpable, a collective awareness that they were no longer the ones calling the shots. The small-town police officers who had been so sure of themselves just hours before now found themselves out of their depth, caught in the web of a much larger operation. Agent Sarah Whitaker, the lead federal agent, emerged from one of the SUVs. She was calm, collected, and exuded an air of authority that immediately commanded the room's attention. As she moved toward the entrance of the station, her dark suit was perfectly tailored, fitting her like a second skin. She didn't look at the officers who had been stationed outside. Instead, her gaze was fixed firmly ahead, as if she had already seen everything that was about to unfold. There was no room for hesitation or second-guessing in her world. She stepped through the door with a quiet confidence, the soft click of her heels the only sound that followed her. The officers inside the station immediately straightened at her presence, their demeanor shifting in response to the authority she carried with her. The usual small-town energy, full of mundane chatter and disorganization, fell silent as Agent Whitaker walked through the door. Her very presence seemed to change the air in the room, and for the first time the officers realized how much larger this situation had become. Without wasting time, Agent Whitaker introduced herself with a voice that was calm but firm. "Agent Sarah Whitaker, FBI," she said, her tone brokering no questions. "I'm here to take custody of Danny Reginald and the case he's been carrying." The words landed with a heavy weight in the room. For the officers, it was as if a veil had been lifted. Their previous uncertainty about what was happening, the strange alerts, the unusual instructions now seemed like mere prelude to the arrival of this woman and her team. They had been caught in something far beyond their control, and it was clear that they no longer had any say in the matter. Agent Whitaker's eyes briefly scanned the room, taking in the officers standing at attention. She didn't make small talk or exchange pleasantries. There was no need for that. She had a job to do, and nothing else mattered. Turning her gaze toward the officer closest to her, she added, "Where is Mr. Reginald?" The officer, now fully aware of the shift in power, swallowed hard before gesturing toward the holding room. "He's been placed in the back," he said, his voice lower than usual. "He's been calm, no issues. But we weren't sure what we had." The officer's words trailed off, his uncertainty hanging in the air. The FBI, however, seemed unbothered by his hesitation. Agent Whitaker nodded slightly, acknowledging his response without another word. The officers, now clearly out of their element, guided Agent Whitaker down the narrow hall, towards the holding room where Danny sat, still as a statue, waiting for whatever came next. The heavy thud of their footsteps echoed in the quiet station as they moved past desks and empty chairs, past the cluttered rooms where officers had been working just hours before. Every hallway felt narrower now, the weight of the situation pressing in on everyone present. As they reached the holding room, Agent Whitaker paused for just a moment outside the door, her hand resting briefly on the cold metal handle. She didn't need to speak. The silence spoke for her. The room inside was stark and functional, a simple bench, a camera, and the faint hum of the building. It was the kind of room meant to hold someone temporarily, a place to keep them until their fate was decided. But for Danny, this room was just a brief stop on a much longer journey, one that had started decades ago and had led him here, to this very moment. The door creaked open and Danny stood slowly, as if expecting them. His expression remained calm, his face unreadable. He didn't look at the officers, nor did he speak. He simply watched Agent Whitaker approach, his hands folded neatly in front of him. The room was quiet when Agent Sarah Whitaker stepped inside to speak with Danny. The only sound was the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, their flickering a subtle reminder of the gravity of the situation. Inside, Danny sat on the same bench he had been placed on hours ago, his posture still straight, his expression calm, as though the storm that had led him here hadn't affected him at all. Agent Whitaker took a moment to observe him before she sat across from him, her demeanor no different than before, cold, professional, yet there was an underlying calmness to her. She wasn't here to interrogate him, but to finalize what had already been decided. She had already read the files, already known what was inside that case. The time had come for Danny to fulfill his role, and it was clear that he had already accepted that responsibility long ago. The conversation between them was brief, hardly more than a few exchanged words. But in that moment there was a silent understanding between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of the weight Danny had carried for so long. Whatever had been said in that room was personal, something that only he and Agent Whitaker needed to know. No one else had to understand, because in the end, Danny had done his part. When the door opened again, The officers who had been waiting outside felt the shift in the air immediately. The tension that had hung in the station like a storm cloud now began to clear. Agent Whitaker stepped out, her face unreadable, but there was something different in her eyes, a slight softening, a quiet respect that hadn't been there before. She turned to the sergeant, her voice calm but firm. "Danny Reginald is to be released immediately," she said, her words leaving no room for argument. "He is not under arrest. He is to be treated as a protected individual under federal oversight." The sergeant blinked in surprise. He had expected something different, maybe more paperwork, maybe some kind of explanation, but the directness of Agent Whitaker's orders left him with no choice but to comply. "Understood," he said quietly, though his mind was still racing to process the implications of what had just happened. This was no longer just about a simple traffic stop. It was about something far bigger, something that was beyond his jurisdiction. As the federal agents began to examine the case, they handled it with the care of people who understood its significance, though none of them truly knew what it held. The case, though old and worn, was something of immense importance, something that had been hidden away for decades. As the lock clicked open, the contents inside were revealed: yellowed documents, a flash drive wrapped carefully in a padded pouch, photographs that had faded with age, and, at the very bottom, a small black device, flat and rectangular, with a serial number barely visible, worn from years of use. Agent Whitaker stood over the case, her gaze sharp as she took in the contents. She didn't need to be told what it all meant. She had been briefed, and she knew exactly what Project Emberwatch was. But the others in the room, the officers who had been so puzzled by Danny's actions, now saw the truth. They were looking at the physical remnants of a long-buried Cold War-era operation. The files, the device, and the photographs were all that remained of an operation so secret, so dangerous, that it had been sealed away from public knowledge after everything had gone wrong. The man they had arrested, the quiet old man who had seemed so ordinary, had been the last person left to carry the responsibility of ensuring the evidence was delivered to the right hands. And now, at long last, that promise had been fulfilled. Agent Whitaker's voice softened as she turned to the officers who had gathered around, still trying to process what they had just witnessed. "Danny Reginald made a promise to a dying friend decades ago," she explained. "A promise to protect the contents of this case and deliver it to the proper authorities when the time was right. That time has come." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. There was no fanfare, no recognition, just a quiet, steadfast dedication to a promise made long ago. Danny had not acted out of self-interest or for personal gain. He had been part of something much larger than himself, an operation that had been buried so deep that no one had expected it to surface again. But Danny had kept his word. He had carried that case, holding on to it with the kind of responsibility most people would never understand. And tonight, at the cost of his own quiet life, that promise had finally been fulfilled. "He did something incredibly important," Agent Whitaker continued, her voice steady but tinged with respect. "Something that no one would have suspected. He's been carrying the weight of this for far too long, and now it's over." Danny Reginald, the man who had lived so quietly in Ravenswood, had done something that would never be known to the public, that would never make headlines. But for those who understood, who could see beyond the surface, Danny had done what was right, even though no one would ever truly understand the full scope of his actions. And as for Danny, he didn't need recognition. He never had. All he needed was to keep the promise he had made so many years ago. And now, with that promise fulfilled, he could rest. When Danny left the station, it was as if the world had returned to normal. But for him, nothing would ever be quite the same. The officers, the agents, none of them knew what to say to him. They watched him leave quietly, his steps measured, his demeanor unchanged. As he walked out into the rain-soaked night, the weight of the case and the truth it carried was no longer his to bear. But the silence that followed him was heavy, filled with the unspoken acknowledgement of what he had done. Back in Ravenswood, life carried on in its usual rhythm. The rain eventually gave way to clearer skies, and the streets returned to their quiet, familiar hum. The local shopkeeper was still at his post, the children still played in the park, and the townspeople still exchanged the same friendly greetings when they passed each other on the street. But there was an undercurrent of change, a subtle shift in the way people looked at Danny. It wasn't fear, they had known him for too long for that. It wasn't pity either. It was understanding, a quiet respect that didn't need to be spoken aloud. People could feel that Danny had carried a burden for many years, a burden far heavier than anyone had ever imagined. Now that burden was gone, and though it would never be spoken of directly, those who had known him sensed that something had shifted. They treated him differently, not because they were afraid, but because they knew he had done something important, something none of them would ever fully understand. Weeks passed and Danny fell back into his routine. He didn't change much. He still sat on his porch with his tea, still drove his old truck into town for his weekly errands, and still greeted his neighbors with the same quiet nod. But the people who saw him, those who took the time to notice, began to regard him with a new reverence, as if the quiet man who had lived among them for so many years was now something more, something that the rest of the world would never fully grasp. Then, one morning, just after sunrise, a government car pulled into Danny's driveway. It was sleek, black, and unmistakably official. A man in a dark suit stepped out, holding a small wooden box in his hands. Danny had been expecting this in some small way. He had carried his promise for so long, and now it seemed this was the final gesture. The official walked up to his door, and Danny opened it with the same quiet grace he always had. The man handed over the box without a word, no ceremony, no explanation. It was simply placed into Danny's hands. Inside the box, Danny found a folded flag neatly pressed and carefully tucked within the confines of the wooden box. Alongside it was a letter from a federal director, signed with a name Danny didn't recognize. The letter was brief, but its meaning was clear. It said, "Your delivery made the truth possible. His name will not be forgotten. Neither will yours." Danny didn't need anything more than that. The words carried the weight of everything he had done, of everything he had sacrificed. He didn't need medals, accolades, or public recognition. He had made a promise, and he had kept it. That was enough. He placed the box on a shelf above his fireplace, next to the small knickknacks and mementos that had gathered dust over the years. It wasn't something he pointed out to visitors. It wasn't for them. It was his, and it would remain his. But every now and then, when he sat in his favorite chair, sipping his tea and watching the world outside, his eyes would drift toward the box. And in those quiet moments he would sit a little straighter, the weight of the promise fulfilled settling in his chest. The flag, the letter, the photograph of his closest friend, they were symbols of something much larger than himself. They were reminders of a time in his life that no one would ever understand, a time that belonged only to him and the man who had made him promise. And though the world moved on, Danny knew that what he had done had made a difference, even if no one would ever know how. As the years went on, Danny continued his quiet life in Ravenswood, unaffected by the world outside. The people of the town still saw him as the man he always had been, a quiet, stoic figure who kept to himself. But there was always a new layer to him now, something unspoken that connected him to a world far beyond the simple rhythms of their small town. Occasionally, when he sat in his chair, looking out over the road, his gaze would settle on the wooden box. It was his constant companion, the physical manifestation of the promise he had kept, of the burden he had carried. And in those moments of silence, Danny would find a quiet peace, a peace that came not from recognition, but from knowing that the truth had been delivered. His friend's name would not be forgotten, and neither would his own. He had done what was right. He had kept his promise, and that was all he needed.